Hello and welcome to Dialogue. China is to include New Zealand in the list of unilateral visa-free countries. The news was announced by Chinese Premier Li Qiang during his visit to New Zealand, the first such trip in 7 years. The two sides also officially launched negotiations on the services trade as part of the update to their free trade agreement. So what is the state of the bilateral ties? How is the relationship being affected? Probably by the U.S. strategic competition with China. And how can the two countries manage their differences to further boost their relationship? Join us for our discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Wang Huiyao, President of the Center for China and Globalization, David Mahon, Executive Chairman of Mahon China Investment Management, Fran O'Sullivan, Managing Director of NZ INC and Columnist for the New Zealand Herald, and Anna-May Isbey, Executive Director of the New Zealand Business Roundtable in China. Welcome to Dialogue. So let's start with the relationship, in particular the trade ties between the two countries. So Fran, I will start with you. How do you, characterize this trade relationship between the two countries? We have the numbers of 38 New Zealand dollars in terms of the total trade volume between two countries, or some more than 23 billion US dollars. So tell us more about that.
Well, I guess the trade relationship has grown exceptionally fast. If we go back to when we started talking about an FTA, it was only 4 billion New Zealand dollars between New Zealand and China. So over that period of time, some 20 years, you can see to where we've got to today. I think the relationship is cordial. It's been through, obviously, pressures during COVID, for instance, with some of our exports. But through that time, we did keep exporting. I guess the areas which have been under pressure have probably been education and also tourism coming into New Zealand, and that's been a result of COVID. We heard today during various meetings with the Premier and hearing from Air New Zealand and others that they expect recovery to about 70% of the pre-COVID for tourism by the end of the year. And I think going the other way, the announcement of the Premier that New Zealand will have visa-free entry into China for a limited period of time, that also ought to boost ties as well.
So Anna, obviously in some areas, at least in tourism, we are still recovering in terms of these trade ties. I know your organization is going to release a survey in next month, in July. So any information available to share now?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for your question. As you mentioned, we recently just completed our second annual Business Outlook survey. And this year we got responses from 60 New Zealand business leaders who have operations in China. So this survey, it covers general market outlook, it covers the opportunities and challenges, the bilateral relationship, investment and HR. And as you mentioned, we haven't yet published the report, but for all the viewers out here, it will be published on July 25th and available to the public if you search up our website. But some really good stats for you all, just to really demonstrate the value and the strength, I think, of the New Zealand and China trade relationship. We asked the companies a number of questions, and 50% of those companies, actually, they've been operating in China for more than 10 years. 82% of the respondents, they rank China as their top or one of their top 3 priority markets in their global investment plans. 90% of the companies said the scale of market opportunities was their top reason for being in China. And 71% of companies said that over the next 3 years, they are looking to increase their investment into the Chinese market. So, those numbers, they do demonstrate there's a huge amount of investment and commitment that New Zealand companies have here into the market.
Yeah, more than 70% looking at expanding their business in China. So there's, can we say, a lot of optimism for the future relationship here?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's definitely challenges, and I think Fran, she mentioned a few of them. But New Zealand companies, they are optimistic. There is definitely a level of optimism there.
Let's take a look at, of course, what the latest, the Premier's visit to New Zealand. So, David, you have business in China. You have been in China for a long time. And so what's your takeaway of the visit?
It's a very good event. It's, as we know, one of three senior people. Of course, Li Qiang is the most senior. And also as a premier, he's got a great history of brokering foreign business deals, particularly when he was in Zhejiang and Shanghai. So I think it's a very important step. It's very difficult for the New Zealand government at the moment, as it is for all Western governments. There is a trade war with the US and China, and the US is putting pressure on countries to join them in their strategies. So it's very difficult for a small country like New Zealand that has deep historical relationships with the States to manage that. But I think despite that, there's enough experience in New Zealand in respect of China and enough people who know how to think about China that it'll be a bit bumpy, but I think that we'll continue as we have been, and I can see an increased interest. At the moment, a lot of boards are a bit cautious. They read in newspapers negative stuff, they're not quite sure. But I think we'll get through this. As long as we don't join AUKUS, I think we'll be in good shape. So I think there's great potential.
Huiyao, of course, we see earlier this year, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi was in New Zealand, and then Liu Jianchao, the head of the international department of the CPC, of course, also went to New Zealand, and now the premier. I mean, the frequency of the visits by senior Chinese leaders, probably say something about the relationship here.
Well, absolutely. I think the relationship is fabulous. I was quite impressed with the New Zealand and China relationship development, particularly in recent year or two. And as you highlighted by Mr. Wang Yi, Minister Liu Jianchao, now by Premier Li Qiang, very significant. And also, I was in New Zealand last month attending the China Business Summit. I think France was organized that, and it was quite impressive. I was quite impressed and moved to see such a large crowd of 400 or 500 people attending the business summit. And then New Zealand Prime Minister was there, the Minister of Trade was there, and Chinese ambassador was there. It was such a spectacular event. I had a chance to speak there too. So I think New Zealand and China, probably New Zealand is one of the most friendly Western relations with China, and they have a lot of potentials. Even though they may be a little far away, but then that cannot stop all the cooperation, student exchanges. We have 20,000 Chinese students in New Zealand, and we have tourism, as we mentioned. Now it's good news now for the visa to be opened now for New Zealand come to China, and we have all those agricultural, milk and minerals and many things to collaborate. But on top of that, I think New Zealand has some soft power. For example, New Zealand launched the CPTPP, which is one of the early countries launching that, and China wants to join CPTPP. I think New Zealand has an enormous, collaboration potential with China, and also New Zealand launched the DEPA, Digital Economic Partnership, which is also again China wants to join that, and we're in good discussion. And of course, on top of that, New Zealand is part of this RCEP, the largest free trade agreement in the world. So I think we have many similarity interests. I'm sure with the premier visit, we're going to enhance, enlarge, and improve our bilateral relations. And also set a good example how friendly, although we have a different system, of different culture, but we can get along very well. And that's a good example of, I think, New Zealand-China development, pathway for many countries to see a good example.
Well, there's a lot of information there, details. Let's break down a little bit later here. Fran, going back to you here, of course, the New Zealand Prime Minister Christopher Luxon said, he hopes trade with China will continue to support his government's goal to double the value of exports in the next decade. So can we say the goal from the New Zealand is to expand trade with China? And I guess that's the same from Chinese side.
Well, it was interesting because the Premier picked up those comments as well. And in his own formal statement to media post the talks with Mr. Luxon, he did actually also say the role that China could play in assisting New Zealand to double exports by value within a decade. And I guess movement on the services, trade is part of that, various new areas of cooperation, talking about working together in terms of scientific collaboration. And I think today in New Zealand, he did go and visit a plant and food research place in scientific establishment in Auckland. He was keenly interested in that. And in the various dialogues I have observed today, particularly one he had with 18 CEOs, he was asking them what particularly they wanted to also achieve in China and how China could help. In an exercise in soft power from China's side, I think it was pretty successful today with the New Zealand business community, and that probably offsets some of the other issues around China and also the United States, which have permeated dialogue in New Zealand in recent months.
Fran, of course, tell us more about, for those who are not familiar with this relationship in terms of trade, for example, what China buys from New Zealand and vice versa, and what's the potential in what area we are looking at for expansion?
Well, I think dairy is still very much our major export internationally, and I think you have to think as our trade is kind of like, as it's been put to me, kind of like an Eiffel Tower. We have several large companies at the top, and then we actually funnel out to a lot of small to medium enterprises. So it's the kiwi fruit industry, it's apples, it's meat, it's forestry, it's all of those things. But there's also avenues for newer areas of collaboration and cooperation, around geothermal, for instance, around what's happening in IP, all of that, and creative industries. These are areas, for instance, gaming. These are areas where there's commonality between New Zealand and China. But to get to those big numbers, we have to continue to grow with China and at the same time expand our footprint as China is doing into Southeast Asia, for instance. I mean, those markets, if we are in at an earlier phase, over time, and if we grow with those markets in the way we have with China over 10, 20 years, that also ought to make our trade much more substantial.
Much more substantial. Anna, earlier you mentioned about New Zealand companies, their commitment to China market here rather. So tell us, in what area they are concentrating or what area they are looking at to expand their business in China.
Yeah, absolutely. So, during our survey, the New Zealand companies, they highlighted a couple of following market opportunities for them. So, number one, it was expanding into new cities and regions, especially those tier 2 and those tier 3 cities. Those are priority. China's urbanization rate, it's reached already 66.16% as of 2023. And, that's really leading to a growth in the middle class. New Zealand products, particularly our food and beverage offerings, they are premium and they are well positioned to target and expand into those growing middle class segments in these cities. New Zealand companies, they're also really looking at developing strong e-commerce capabilities. E-commerce here is huge. And they're also looking at reinforcing the Chinese consumers' view of New Zealand as producing high quality, safe and sustainable products. One thing that we're really noticing as New Zealand businesses is that the tide is starting to turn in China towards sustainability, and New Zealand brands, they've already demonstrated such strength here and they can continue and are continuing to play into this.
Well, David, of course, during this visit, the two countries have officially launched this negotiation on services trade. Tell us, what is the situation? How important is it for both countries here?
Well, as Fran said, we have for a small country, an interesting structure to our economy. And already the largest companies are here and they're very successful. I mean, Fonterra, after it restructured its positions in China, has been making a lot of money. I think they are constituting something like 43% of the dairy sector in ingredients. They're sort of arbiter of prices here. Big team in Shanghai. They also, you look to Zespri, kiwi fruit was a 40% increase in fruit this year. I think we passed $1 billion New Zealand dollars of sales. Apples too, as Fran identified. New Zealand apples have a very strong market. Unfortunately, they're much in demand in other parts of the world, but they sell well here. So you go to the other things we have, and New Zealand has a long tradition in engineering and scientific creativity. We have a client that has a robotic system for handling logs at ports, and also for handling produce in packing houses. And there's great potential with the drive of investment in technology in China for New Zealand companies to use their know-how, their IP as capital, and form partnerships. But you go beyond that, and it hasn't been, because of COVID, it has not been so frequent, but if you will remember that film Lord of the Rings, one of the major players in the things in that film, all the items, the masks, the look of the film, was Sir Richard Taylor with Weta Workshop. He has a long relationship with China. So he's coming back into the market. They're looking at more and more opportunities. One of our clients is Les Mills, which is a fitness company, and it is considered the leading group fitness system in China. They have a 10-year residency now and is a fully owned foreign company in Shanghai. So I think we have to stop thinking just about primary industries or even technology and look into where we can be sharing know-how, where we can sharing the intellectual capital of New Zealand. So there are many opportunities. I think part of it would be we lack people, so we would like perhaps more Chinese companies to be looking at partnering and investing in these businesses.
Investment and of course there's talked about the approach, Henry, where it's like a negative list. Basically, we have a list that is specific. Beyond that, that's free for investment and trade. So that's the Euro practice. So of course we would like to see a shorter and shorter negative list there. So how do you look at this approach, between the two countries here?
The negative list.
Huiyao, please. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think there's many more area of collaboration, and service trade is certainly a big area. I think we can start on that, and also digital. I mean, New Zealand is quite advanced in terms of digital, particularly on the making those digital rules and regulations. Is already they've done a lot of work already, and China can work with the DIPA on that. And then another thing is New Zealand is very friendly and very clean and environmental friendly country. So climate change is another area that we can collaborate, very much so. And also the other thing I see New Zealand has a huge potential with relatively large territory and a very small population. And there could be more student tourism, immigration, all those exchanges. And also the other thing is that New Zealand is an English-speaking country, native English-speaking, and there's 200 million Chinese learning English, and then that could be a very good destination for study a variety of subjects. And finally, I think that New Zealand is pursued a quite fairly autonomous policy towards China. I think though there may be some talking about AUKUS that they want to invite New Zealand to join. We haven't seen any further move on that. But it's really important that New Zealand keep this strategic neutrality so that we can make a Pacific, South Pacific more nuclear free and maybe more stable. And so I think also on the multilateralism, New Zealand has been very active in the WTO, WHO, or UN system. I think China and New Zealand can also work in many other areas. So even though we have a different cultural system, but many ways we see the things that we can work together, particularly on the trade, even global governance, digital, artificial intelligence, you name it. There's so many new areas that New Zealand can be a very good partner to collaborate. We can work in the third countries, developing countries. We can partner with New Zealand companies, and of course, New Zealand brand has a premier. So I was at the conference in New Zealand last month, and I saw a lot of pharmaceutical, some natural food company if they carry a New Zealand brand or made in New Zealand, that would be premier to sell in China as more healthy, more affordable product. So I think the cooperation between China and New Zealand, the potential is enormous, and we can continue on that, and also the culture and all those exchanges. It's a good example of how a Western country collaborate with China can produce a win-win situation for all of us and for the world.
Yeah, Harry, you mentioned earlier about CPTPP. China has applied to join such a free trade deal, and also DPA, Digital Economic Partnership. Where is the application now, and how much do we know about the stance from the New Zealand government? How supportive is it?
Well, I think on those two initiatives, CPTPP is already a very high standard 21st century trade agreement, which started originally by New Zealand, Singapore, and four countries as TPP, and later US and all the other, Japan, Canada, Australia all joined in now. And so you can see New Zealand was a free trade promoter at the very beginning. And I think on that front, China Minister of Foreign Commerce, Minister Wang, has actually applied to join CPTPP to New Zealand because they are the deposit country of the documents of the New Zealand of the CPTPP now. So I think New Zealand could have a lot of potential to really help Chinese companies to meet the standards and to have a more familiarization with the rules and regulation. So I think there's some discussion going on, but we hope to have more New Zealand support and also collaboration, and more in terms of making the guidelines and the rules and more accessible. But I'm very hopeful is this DPA, digital partnership, which is right now only New Zealand, Singapore, and Chile, and then there's only 3 countries, and then probably another country wants to join South Korea, and then China would be really interesting to join that. China being the 2nd largest digital country in the world would love to join, and then New Zealand already have as a founding member of the DPA, could give a more access to talk to China, and also bring China into this new alignment, so that we can expand the global digital. So all those things you can show that New Zealand, even though it's not a huge country, but have a lot of important role to play in promoting the trade, in promoting the balanced globalization, and then in promoting cooperation with China. So I would really see that as a really a soft power of New Zealand. I would like to see that bridging the gap between China and the Western countries, bridging the gap between China and the U.S. even, or other Pacific countries. So also for the APAC, we've been working for APAC, and New Zealand is an important country for APAC, Australia and many others. Let's all work on that to continue to uphold the spirit of free trade, and maybe realize Asia Pacific Free Trade Agreement, which is a proposal made by APAC many years ago. Let's continue to do that. So we should not lose APAC, even though we are talking a lot about Indo-Pacific now.
Right.
Asia Pacific is still very relevant and important.
Well, David, of course, there's a big picture. Earlier we mentioned more or less about U.S. strategic competition with China, U.S. policy on China. Somehow countries in the middle, they are under pressure, to choose side. We have Prime Minister Luxon, had stated that New Zealand, China engage where we have shared interests, and we speak frankly and constructively with each other. Where we have differences, and local media reported the visit took place at a time when security concerns threatened to overshadow a relationship dominated by trade. What do you make of that? What kind of security interests here that are seen as threats?
Well, the United States is a waning empire, a retreating empire. And at any point, there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of insecurity in an empire that begins to shrink. It's lost a lot of influence globally, and it fears losing influence in Asia and Asia Pacific. So the tension comes from that. It also comes from the fact that China is so much stronger. Economically, China is now actually, if you take purchasing power parity, 20% larger than the United States. So it is a fact that China is going to be an economic force for all trading partners. You talk about diversification, you end up in a subset of China if you don't think it through and you diversify away. So these are the tensions. They are really existential tensions. They're not real tensions as one would imagine with war brewing. And if you look at the sanctions, they are the sanctions of a country at war coming out of Washington. But I think for the rest of it, too much is made of the military tensions in Asia. I think both America and China are very contained and restrained. I also think that the rest of Southeast Asia has been managing such things for a very long time. So I think New Zealand shouldn't worry too much about balancing things, being in the middle. We can make too much of these things. And I had conversations recently here in Beijing, and one person close to the New Zealand-China relationship said, New Zealand currently has a coalition government that has in itself some contradictions. And he said, we are accustomed to coalition governments and the individuals involved. And so we don't see this as some definitive point. But now New Zealand is talking more about a closer relationship with America or these security issues. It's a sort of echo that goes around a lot of Western countries' conversations. But in reality, there isn't really anything that could blow up soon. I don't think anyone wants direct confrontation. So these are issues of political and historical issues, as I said, around the shrinking American empire. So I think if New Zealand can just keep its head and not worry about where it stands too much, China understands the pressure it's under. And I think they will be understanding in the few years to come. So I don't like it, but I'm not too concerned. I think, as Fran would attest, and she's been at the heart of these things in New Zealand a lot more than I have, she knows that we've weathered many things like this before, and I'm sure we'll get through this one.
Fran, finally, I mean, how much a factor is the security concerns in terms of decision making or expanding businesses for the business community in New Zealand?
Yeah, it's very interesting, and the Premier, in essence, speaking with business during the roundtable, was essentially asking them to be more frank and open in dialogue themselves and about their own interests. Look, I think it's fair to say we've seen an evolution of foreign policy over the last 2 to 3 years. It is much more focused on security and power. In the past, we were very focused on multilateralism and the rules-based order, in which we were, prime movers in as you mentioned earlier, with the DEPA and what is now CPTPP. We're at the heart of all of that. But right now, there is much more of a focus on security and on power. And so that tension exists. We are drawn more into the US orbit. But at the same time, I think this visit has been very useful to help balance those interests, to balance the economic relationship that we have with China, and to also balance the pressure that obviously comes on small nations from the United States as well. So it's very interesting. I think both sides basically said through the talks in the last 24, 48 hours, supporting dialogue, not confrontation, keeping the dialogue opening. Behind scenes, I understand the conversations were quite hard and difficult, but they had the conversations on the difficult issues between both sides. But in public, the words have been optimistic and people are looking forward.
Well, let's keep being optimistic. On that note, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.